Hey everybody, Michael LeJeune here with Game Changers for Government Contractors. And I have an old good friend here, Mr. Steven Koprince. I'm excited about this podcast. Mr. Retired Steven Koprince, who cranks out more content than I do. Is that what I have to look forward to, Steven? When I retire, I'm actually going to do more work on the back end on content. So
Yeah,
it's just going to shift from one area to the other. So
it could be, I mean, that's, I'm not hardwired to do, just sit in front of the TV and do nothing, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm a former government contracts attorney, spent 16, 17 years practicing law, built a small firm that did federal contracts work, and now I'm, sold my interest in that firm, retired from the practice of law, but I am still teaching. I'm serving on board of directors of a government contractor, and yeah, I'm writing a lot of content about government contracting as well. I think because my brain is now hardwired to be curious about what's going on in that field and to want to uh, put my thoughts out to the world about government contracting, for better or for worse. And so, yeah, that is at this point at least retirement for me, and it's not a bunch of soap operas in front of the TV.
yeah, or pickleball or whatever it may
Well,
be, right?
pickleball is part of it. I'm not gonna
Pickleball is
lie. Like,
part of it.
I got the
Yeah.
pickleball shirt on right now, so
Yeah,
it's,
yeah, yeah.
it's
It's and you're one of the people who very few blogs became very trusted early on for years and years and years. Still, now that the team has kind of carried that on, so the love of writing has always been there. It shows through. You've written several books. Um, y- you know, I really appreciate all the information you guys share. And for those that are not following Steven on LinkedIn, go follow him on LinkedIn, connect with him there, and follow along with all the things he's writing, because you always get into, whether it's cases or whatever it may be, there's interesting things that happen, in government, and you have a great breakdown of those. And I'll go the step further here. I know this isn't necessarily a commercial for you, but I'm going to make one. You go the step further of making it in plain English, because I know there's a lot of attorney speak, lawyer speak, whatever you want to call it, where it's difficult to understand, and you make it very, very simple for folks to understand. So I appreciate that. And I know everybody that I passed that on to really appreciates that. So it's really good stuff, man.
Well, thank you. And yeah, my mission has always been to try to explain government contracting topics, many of which are legal topics. I mean, the FAR is a
Yeah.
series of laws, but to explain them in plain English for smart people who are involved in government contracting, who are maybe business owners, they may be officers or otherwise involved in the contracting community, but they didn't have the pleasure of 3 years of law school, and they
Yeah.
weren't taught to write in Latin and throw in all these funky phrases. And so,
Yeah.
there's a difference, and it's an important one, between writing a legal brief and writing a blog post, because your audience is different, and the
Right.
way you try to convey information is different. And so, when I had new attorneys that came on and joined my firm, I'd try to teach them that, because it's like when you go to law school, you're almost it's almost like you forget how to write like a human being. You start writing like a
Yeah.
robot lawyer, and so your thank you letter to grandma at Christmas is like, "Dear sir" or "Madam," And so it's like, people don't talk
Yeah.
like that in real life.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so yeah, that's always been my goal, is to make it understandable while still conveying the same
Yeah.
substance
Yeah.
to folks.
My favorite words are like the hereto and forthwith and all these different things. And you're like,
Like,
what's going on here, right?
unnecessary. Even in legal writing, you don't need that stuff. But you
Right.
start throwing it into a blog, it's like, people
What's
don't
going
write
on?
like that. Like,
Yeah,
that's
what's going on? It's so wild.
yeah.
Well, I had reached out to you because I was just annoyed, is really the only way to put it, with a lot of what I consider misinformation on this one particular topic of being the middleman. And I sent you a couple of videos. I'm like, hey, I think these are a little off the rails. And I think your comment was, these are way off the rails,
Yeah.
on how wild the depiction is on what the quote middleman strategy is in the government. And I think part of the whole middleman appeal, if you will, is there are a lot of people working a second job, trying to figure out how to get that side hustle going. And this just happened to be something where people are like, oh, this might be a really good side hustle that I can promote. Let me build a course around it. Let me write a white paper or a blog or a free ebook or something around it. And then I'm going to use that as a funnel to sell people in my stuff. And there's just so many gaps in the information that, as I'm sitting there watching a lot of videos, and we won't get into anybody's particular video. And I want to say this too. It's not one or two particular people that I have seen do this. I've just seen dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of videos from all kinds of different creators that just make me scratch my head. It's like, what are you doing? Clearly you either don't know the law, or you don't know how this works, or you don't care. And I don't know which one it is. Don't really care. But I thought we would get on and I would have someone who has a legal background come in here and talk to the folks to educate them a little bit on the do's and don'ts for this, because there's some situations where you could do, I don't want to say the middleman strategy, but you could implement something like that. So why don't you kind of kick us off with maybe some of your observations and what you have seen in this realm?
Yeah, and that's again, we're not going to name names. I think that's the way to go. But I was pretty shocked when I watched those videos that you sent me, because I've heard this kind of percolating out there, middleman strategy, and I haven't paid much attention to it. I'm like, that's just that's noise. I'm not gonna. But then I realized how popular some of these videos were, and that a lot of people are watching them. And I think you're absolutely right that especially post-COVID, this whole notion of side hustles and, so-and-so retired early. I shouldn't be talking, but yeah, let me get my side hustle going. And everybody's looking for that way to, make a lot of money without having to do a whole lot of work, frankly. I mean, that should be a warning in and of itself, that when someone approaches you, or that you see on YouTube or wherever that you may go, this notion of, no matter what the field is, that you can make a lot of money without doing much work, you ought to be, your red flag, ought to be waving already. Like, as in, I better be really careful, because that sounds too good to be true. And usually when something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so looking at these middleman videos, at least the ones that I reviewed, I mean, they ranged from just kind of doing the old Seinfeld yada yada past the key parts, which are the laws, right? It's kind of like, hey, it's like, go bid some jobs and yada yada. There's some FAR stuff, so be sure you comply with it, make a lot of money. But the stuff in the middle was really important. And so there's the videos that do that, just kind of skip over it. And then there are ones that just blatantly tell you that and I will tell you that if you follow the advice in the video, you would be breaking the law. You would be breaking the law. So you're absolutely right. There are areas where you could, in government contracting, narrow areas where if everything goes according to plan and the competition is in the right dollar value and it's the right type of product or service, and all the stars align, you might be able to essentially do this middleman strategy. Although even then, there are things that you need to know about compliance and your responsibility and so on and so forth. But in specific, a lot of cases, it's not viable, that you're going to be breaking the law, and with respect to limitations on subcontracting, what's called ostensible subcontractor affiliation, as well as taking on all sorts of legal risks that you're probably not familiar with. So I'm going to stop there and let you ask specific questions. I don't want to just ramble, but it's, you got to know what the laws are around this, and then figure out specifically if the acquisition that you're looking at fits within the, I won't call them loopholes, but is okay to bid on as a middleman, which many are not. And B, even if so, whether you're prepared to take on the obligations of a prime contractor, even so, because even if it's legal, doesn't mean it's necessarily a good idea, or that there are no liability potentially attached to it. So I think you have to figure out both those things.
Yeah. Speaking of that, this is slightly off that. I had a client, so a couple of years ago, called me and said, hey, we work with this one agency. I think it was the Army, and they're wanting some treadmills for their gym. And we don't know where to get treadmills. So they told us, they pulled up a Walmart treadmill and said, we'd like 5 of those. And I was like, do you know anything about treadmills? Have you ever sold treadmills? Nope. Like, do you know what the warranty is on that? What happens if you sell them the wrong treadmill or some sort of issue? This gets put in the gym, and 3 out of 5 people that get on it first fall and break a hip. Like, what are you prepared to deal with that? Because then now they're like, hey, something's faulty with the treadmill. Like, do you know anything about this? And they're like, no, we know nothing about, and this was the exact example. And it's just one of those things where even if you should you And the answer is not always yes. And so it's very interesting where, you can wind up in a legal battle. You know how that is, right? Everybody loves to sue everybody in this country these days. But back onto the middleman side of it, one of the things that I have seen that I think needs a little bit of a spotlight on it is when I see a lot of these people talking about this strategy. These people are also, whether it's in the video that we're talking about or in another one, really promoting the small business statuses, whether it's 8A, WSB, whatever. And when you start to mix a status contract with the middleman strategy, right? That right there is with it's oil and gas, right? Or fire and gas, whatever you want to call it. It's nasty. So maybe start there of when you start mixing small business, because I think people look at it and go, well, under simplified acquisition, there's some rules that say you don't necessarily have to do 50% of the work. They skip over the whole if it's full and open, right? So,
Yeah.
so maybe you can shed a little bit of light on middleman strategy with any small business status.
Yeah, and so that's a great question because that's what I saw too. Is like, hey, take advantage of being a small business and do this middleman strategy because the government wants to buy from small businesses, but your solution, and I saw this in one of the videos, your technical solution to this multi-million-dollar bid is literally, I'm going to sub the whole thing to large business X, right? So it's like, hey, and then these are not the names that popped up in the video, but this is an IT services contract. What is your technical solution? It's a small business set aside. It's a $6 million contract. And your technical solution is literally, I will sub everything to Google. And if you're thinking about that just logically, you would probably sit back and say, well, wait a second, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, what is the policy rationale? Why would the government want to just have a small business come in and then apply some sort of markup? And the video is like, maybe it's a 50% markup, which you're not going to win a whole lot of contracts doing that. But and then give the work to a small business or a large business. And the answer is usually that's not going to work. Almost always that's not going to work because the government's policy is we have small business set-asides and these socioeconomic set-asides and sole sources such as 8A, HUBZone, women-owned, service-disabled, veteran-owned for a reason. And that's because we want to grow and expand the universe of qualified, capable businesses who have those capabilities in our nation. We want to grow the industrial base. And so we don't want a nation full of hundreds of one-person companies who then subcontract everything to Google. We want hundreds of small IT services companies who know what the heck they're doing and can provide competitive pricing and can provide some originality and some interesting technical solutions that maybe the big boys and girls haven't even thought of. And so that's the underlying public policy. And that's reflected in the law. And so there are two key laws that come into play when you have this intersection between this middleman idea and then these small business or socioeconomic designations on your contracts or solicitations. And those are what's called the limitations on subcontracting and the ostensible subcontractor affiliation. So I'll take those just very quickly, one, then two. And these are very high-level overviews of relatively complex topics. So limitation on subcontracting is what the name says. It is the notion of, hey, our public policy is that we want to grow and develop small businesses. And so when we have set aside contracts or sole source contracts to small businesses or socioeconomic small businesses, we don't necessarily want to force those businesses to do 100% of the work themselves, because oftentimes that's not very realistic, and that's going to limit the universe of contracts those companies can compete for. Okay, that's one policy. The second policy is, but we also don't want them to subcontract everything to a large business, to Google, to Boeing, to whoever, because then we're not being the underlying policy of growing and developing the capabilities of the small businesses. And so the compromise is what's called limitations on subcontracting. And what that says is that when a company is awarded most contracts that contain a set-aside designation, and I say most because there are some simplified acquisitions that we can talk about separately, but when we talk about those multi-million-dollar contracts that they're showing in some of these videos, then those are going to be subject to the limitations on subcontracting under the FAR, and they're also under the SBA's regulations. And what those limits say is that when a prime contractor is awarded a contract of that type, that designation, small business, it can only subcontract up to a certain percentage of that contract to businesses that don't have the designation. So if you want to subcontract 100% of your contract to another 8A company or another service disabled veteran-owned small business, at least under the limitation on subcontracting, that's fine. But if you want to subcontract 100% to Google, that's not going to fly, because in an IT services contract, the limitation on subcontracting is 50%. And so if you're awarded an IT services contract and you want to subcontract to Google, you've got a hard limit of 50% that can go to Google, and the rest has to be performed by small businesses, self-performed by small businesses. And so that's the first item that folks aren't getting when they're or talking about on these videos, is that if you're have a multi-million-dollar small business set-aside contract and your solution is literally type, I am subbing 100% to Google, it's going to get tossed out. It's a non-compliant solution. It proposes to violate a clause that's right there in the solicitation. And then the second one is what's called ostensible subcontractor affiliation. And that's the notion that a company only qualifies as quote unquote small when it is not affiliated with other companies that are not small. And affiliation means a variety of things, but the ostensible subcontractor affiliation comes up when one of two things is true: when the prime contractor is what's called unusually reliant on its subcontractor, and or where the subcontractor is the one performing the primary and vital, these are terms of art, primary and vital portions of the work. And so when there is an ostensible subcontractor affiliation, the way the SBA determines whether your company is small for that contract is to add your size to your subcontractor size. So if they say, hey, the sub is the one performing the primary and vital work, the primary and vital work, by the way, being kind of what the government's actually buying in that contract, because a lot of these videos say, oh, just do the invoicing and the sub can do all the IT services. Well, the government's not buying the invoicing. That's part and parcel. It's an administrative requirement of the contract, but they're buying the IT services. And so if somehow you squeeze under that 50% limit, but Google's still doing all the IT services and all you're doing is invoicing, then Google is almost certainly going to be called your ostensible subcontractor. And what that means is that the SBA will say, okay, well, your size for this contract is you, which is, your revenue count, plus Google's, which is, billions and billions of dollars. Let's see, is that small? No, it's not small. And so you've lost your small business size test, even though your business independently is small, because Google is running that contract. The team for that contract is not considered small. And so my view when I watch these videos that pledge that solution, and they either yada-yada'd right past those rules, or they just said go ahead and do it without even mentioning that there might be restrictions, is you're asking for a lot of trouble. Like that strategy has got the limitation on subcontracting, you got ostensible subcontractor affiliation. Unless there are exceptions to that, such as some simplified acquisitions, if the video doesn't tell you how their strategy deals with those two items, then they either don't know what they're talking about, or they're trying to pull a fast one.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just don't care. They're like, I just want to sell my course. I want to make this as attractive as it can be and get you in the funnel and sell you something. And because at the end of the day, on marketing, you do try to make things look as easy as possible, right? But there is, not trying to be misleading, and that's where I think a lot of these folks are. One of the things you were just talking about reminded me of a couple of videos, not just one, but a couple of videos I've seen where people say, just go win the work. Like, that's easy, right? If everybody could just go win the work, they would, which kind of makes you think, okay, so if you're just going to go win the work, you're filling out that you're going to be doing it. You're not filling out the sub, because the strategy is just go win the work, and we'll find somebody to do it on the back end once you have the contract in hand. That's a really funny one, because the advice I saw in multiple videos was, once you have the contract in hand, you now have the leverage. And I've negotiated things before, and there's a tiny bit of leverage, but at the end of the day, you're also scared to death because you've agreed to a price without a price quote from your supplier, and now you've got to beg them to do it for the price. But you've already agreed to the government to supply some. To me, the supplier now has the leverage to say, well, I want 80%. I want 90%. I want what it, like, it's not going to be a make one phone call and all of a sudden somebody's going to be like, oh my God, Mike, thank you for calling today. We would love to do this for whatever dollar figure you throw out. Like, they're going to push back in a lot of cases. And depending on the service, like, cause I've seen this a lot in like janitorial and what I would consider, you know, landscaping, blue collar type of jobs. I don't know, Steve, the last time you made a phone call to anybody in that realm, whether it was a construction quote, a landscaping, a deck, a fence, I don't know how easily you, number one, got a hold of somebody. Number two, even got them to give you a quote when you were going to pay them cash directly to do. Like, it's not easy to find somebody to do that. And it sounds like, man, people are just going to be chomping at the bit. And if that person, just call the next person on Google and they'll do it. You know, it'll be simple, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, you raised a lot of great practical questions about this middleman strategy with what you just said, because I mean, it starts with, just go out and bid it, which was, universes of proposal writers just beating their heads into the nearest walls because especially these videos talk about all these multi-million-dollar, multi-year contracts. You don't just like slap a price down and then they give you a contract. I mean, they usually want, here's a detailed technical proposal, explain exactly how you're going to do the work, this, that, and the other. And if the answer that you have at that stage is, I don't have any clue how to write a good proposal, or I'm going to get my sub to write the proposal for me. Well, the sub is probably going to say, well, why am I not just bidding this as prime then?
Right,
if I'm going to have to write the whole proposal and do all the work, like what exactly are you bringing to the table here? So I think that's one of those practical concerns that's absolutely out there. And then, the idea that if you do find the right procurement where you can just say, hey, maybe it's a supply procurement, I'm going to supply you those treadmills and my price is, and you just take a wild stab based on what you saw on Walmart.com. And then you're like, oh, shoot, I can't use those treadmills because they're non-compliant with the non-manufacturer rule, because you're actually trying to comply, and you call them the one manufacturer who can supply a compliant treadmill. You're absolutely right. They've got you then, if you can get a hold of them. And that brings another practical point to me too, which is that if you do find one of those scenarios, maybe it's a simplified acquisition or maybe it's an unrestricted contract where you are able to pull this legally, this middleman strategy off while using, I'm going to sub almost everything to a large business, which there are cases where that, is viable. It's much more limited than you would get from the internet, but there are cases where legally that's viable. In those cases, the subcontractor is typically going to be, if you and I or anybody who's probably watching this is negotiating with Google, do you think Google's going to just sign the contract you send them, or you think maybe they're going to say, here's our subcontract, And when they hand you the subcontract, do you think it's going to be favorable to you, or do you think it's going to be favorable to them? Because once you have that arrangement with the large business and it's on their paper because they wrote the subcontract, because they insisted, because they don't sign some random small business's template subcontract, which probably isn't compliant anyway, and undoubtedly within that document is everything is landed in their favor. And so let's say, for example, you have $1 million contract and you got them to agree to a price of $800,000, and great, you're going to make this profit. But now they decide, you know what, our cost just got so high, so we're going to need an extra $400,000, and they come to you for that. What are you going to do if the subcontract says that they can ask for that and you have to give it to them, or they're allowed to walk off the job? But you don't have that in your contract with the government, right? So now you're stuck. They're saying either you go into a $200,000 hole, pay us more because our subcontract you signed allows us to do that, to make those kinds of changes, or we walk off the job, which the subcontract also allows us to do because we, the large sub, wrote the subcontract in our favor. So, and now you're stuck because, as you said, Mike, the government, it says you, small business, are the awardee of the prime contract. You're responsible for getting this work done. And so if your sub walks off the job, what's your backup plan? And so,
and defaulting on the contract, that's your last contract.
Yeah.
It's the last contract. And if hopefully the only thing that happens in this situation is you never get another contract, you don't get sued by the government or anything. Like you brought up the non-manufacturer rule on the treadmills. That's one of the things I kind of skipped over on that. Of what if you did just procure the treadmills without going through the compliance, and now you've supplied something that is supposed to be compliant because it's going to be in the agreement you sign. You just didn't know what that FAR reg was or any of that. You just read over that, right? And now you're in trouble when somebody does come along and say, wait a minute, why do we have this at the gym? Oh, and they're probably not going to do it unless there's an accident or unless there's an issue of some sort, which happens to soldiers all the time, right? One of the really interesting things that I see happen a lot with the product side of this is, you've got people who they're out there, they're looking for relationships and things like that, and they're really shocked that you can't get them on the phone. They won't sign a reseller agreement. They won't do that. They have territories already, and they're locked out of those things, but they have been quoting. I've one guy that it was probably one of my first calls ever when I got back into GovCon, was a guy who had sold $60,000 worth of toilet paper to one of the agencies, called us up frantically and was like, I don't know where to find it. And like, where did you bid it? He was, oh, on the Sam website, Sam, like Walmart, Sam's. I got it off there and bid that. But there's like a laundry list of that. The other thing that I see a lot these days, I've gotten probably 20 calls or more in just the last 3 months on this particular issue around products, is people who have done some amount of research. They have quoted a product, got somebody who could supply it, all that kind of stuff. And then they hit this snag because they are doing this as a side hustle. They call and say, hey, I can't get a bank to finance this, and the manufacturer wants $50,000.
Right.
They don't have any financing set up. They don't have a relationship with them. They've got a contract, but now they can't supply it because they don't have the funds in place, because they are a startup. They've got $500 in their checking account, no credit cards. And they're like, what do I do? I'm like, well, you're in a pickle. You put yourself in a situation because you didn't have all of those things lined up, but now you've made a promise to the government to deliver, and you've got 2 weeks to figure out a solution. So I mean, those are just some other issues that I see going on with this, where if you don't go far enough down the rabbit hole to understand how to do it right, there's a whole lot of things that kind of come back to you and kind of bite you in the butt at the end of the day. Talk to me a little bit about how and possibly when this would actually work, because I think it would be a disservice to just bash it the whole time. I think we should talk a little bit about where the quote middleman would actually work.
Yeah, and so it can work in certain cases, and again, some of it is on a case by case basis. But let's talk about when it legally would be allowable. I think that's when we let's start with that. That doesn't necessarily, just because it's allowable doesn't mean it's advisable or that you will be the best option for the government there. But let's talk about when it's legally viable. So on the small business side, the time the middleman is going to work with is in two cases, right? On the small business side, or legally will work, is when the company or companies that you want to subcontract with, number one, this is 1 out of 2. Well, number one, have the same status that is required by the underlying contract. And so if the underlying contract is a small business set aside, and your middleman strategy is, I'm going to subcontract all the work, but the company I'm subcontracting all the work to is also a small business, that's allowable, because the policy is to develop small businesses, but not specifically the prime contractor, just to develop small businesses. So if the sub is the one getting developed by that contract, legally speaking, that's fine. You may have other problems with, things like the sub being in control of the job, and you're legally liable if they walk off the job and blah, 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 blah. But those are all risks that you take on. But that is legally viable for you just to subcontract the work to other firms that have the same status that's required by the prime contract, small business, 8A, what have you. So that's number one. The second time that the strategy would be viable is for legally viable at the small business level is for acquisitions that are below the simplified acquisition threshold. And the simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000 now for most acquisitions, $750,000 for certain construction. And by the way, a lot of the videos are not using that as examples. They're using multi-million-dollar contracts. So, but if you say, okay, we're not going to go after those big fancy contracts that require fancy proposals anyway. We're going after the low-hanging fruit, simplified acquisitions. Then yes, then in that case, the SBA's regulations, which have been updated over the last several years, say that the limitations on subcontracting, the non-manufacturer rule, which is essentially, we can talk about that separately, but that's a rule that requires the end manufacturer to be a small business most times that you're selling to the government a product, and the ostensible subcontractor rule. Those rules I mentioned don't apply to acquisitions below the simplified acquisition threshold. So legally speaking, unless there's something else in the contract, if you have a $100,000 acquisition and it's small business set aside, you could then theoretically sub all or most of it to a large business. And so that would allow you, or small business, of course, that would allow you to do that. So those are on the small business cases where you would be allowed to do that. Now, in the first case I mentioned, where you're subbing it all to a small business, one does have to ask, why isn't the sub just bidding it on their own? Because they're allowed to bid it, but assuming you find the right subs, like, no, we don't want to deal with that. We don't want to register in SAM, then you can do that. So subbing to a like business or under simplified acquisition threshold. Those are the two cases where the middleman strategy would be potentially legally viable in a small business universe. And then you've got what's called the unrestricted universe. And that's the case in which there is no small business or socioeconomic designation. And in those cases, there often are not limitations on subcontracting. There can be, contrary to a common misconception. There are clauses, for example, in construction that impose limitations on subcontracting for unrestricted work, and there are clauses talking about excessive pass-through charges and things like that. But just to oversimplify somewhat, if you have an unrestricted contract, then there's generally not going to be a subcontracting limit associated with that. And the ostensible subcontractor rule doesn't matter, because even if you're found affiliated with your subcontractor, it doesn't matter, because you don't have to qualify as any specific size to win that work. And so, again, you have to ask yourself, if you're subbing the whole thing to Google, why didn't Google just bid the whole thing themselves? Because they're allowed to do that, and it's an unrestricted acquisition. But if you can find the right contractor, and sometimes folks do, they find somebody who just has no interest in selling to the government for whatever reason, and it's an unrestricted acquisition, then you can do that middleman. But it does require kind of one of those scenarios to fit, as well as reading the contract to make sure there aren't restrictions like that performance work item I mentioned, like pass-through charge restrictions, things like that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good breakdown there. I'm going to ask a question, and if I'm wrong, we'll just cut this out of the podcast.
Perfect.
So I'll preface it by saying, my understanding is on the simplified acquisition side, the only time that the limitations on subcontracting don't apply is if it's full and open. Is that correct? Or like if it says this is small business, it's under simplified acquisition, because I see that. I see those on SAM where it's a small business and it's under simplified acquisition, then it has to stay small business, right? Because they've attached that status to it. Is that correct? So the only time you'll be able to not do any of the work is if it's just a full and open simplified acquisition. Is that?
Well, I mean, we're close there. So the way the SBA breaks that down is actually they have allowed on the small business set aside to say simplified acquisitions. They've taken the limitation on subcontracting off the table for that. They've said if it's a small business set aside, limitation on subcontracting doesn't apply below the simplified acquisition threshold. That's a change that was made a few years ago. They have not said, it's an important distinction, that for socioeconomic set asides and sole sources, though, that's where the distinction really comes up, is that if you have a $50,000 simplified acquisition for 8A, the limitation on subcontracting still applies. The ostensible subcontractor rule still applies. So for whatever reason, as a policy matter, they exempted small business set-asides from limitation on subcontracting some years ago. Unrestricted too, of course, because there is you don't have to qualify as small to be an unrestricted as well. So they both qualify, but there is this common misconception, because I've seen a lot of folks going, for whatever reason, SDVUSB seems to be the big one that I've seen, service disabled, veteran-owned small business, where folks are saying, oh, it's a simplified acquisition, so I can sub as an SDVOSB prime, I can sub everything to whoever else who's not an SDVOSB. That's not true. The limitation on subcontracting was only waived for the small business size, and it kind of already was implicitly waived for unrestricted because you never had to qualify as small for unrestricted.
Yeah, no, good summary there. So let's talk for a minute as we start to wrap up here about a very common thing that I see in government contracting. It's where I first got introduced to, but it's common in the commercial market. You have the VAR relationship, so the value-added reseller. What is the main difference between a VAR and the middleman strategy? Because VAR relationships are very common throughout the government. So how do you distinguish between those two?
Yeah, and so the value-added resellers, for the most part, there are no exceptions. Just because you label yourself as a VAR, like there's not a other than under maybe one NAICS code, there's not an exception that says, hey, the limitation on subcontracting don't apply because you're a VAR. But let me break that down a little bit more. So value-added resellers most often come up in what's called the context of the non-manufacturer or the sale of products to the government. Or they can come up in other universes as well. And the idea is that we're selling some sort of product to the government, but we're also providing some sort of benefit on top of that. We're providing, it's value added. We're providing some sort of benefit on top of that. So regardless of whether the acquisition is classified that way, or you as a seller classify yourself as a VAR, as a value-added reseller, you still have to follow whatever limitations are set forth in the solicitation if it's a small business set aside. We'll talk about that first. We can talk about unrestricted second. And so if you have a solicitation that is a small business set aside, let's say, and it's classified under the NAICS code, you always look at the NAICS code to see how the government's classifying that work. That's that 6-digit code, and it's classified as an acquisition of products. But the government also wants some sort of services on top of the product. Now you could say we're a value-added reseller. We are reselling, these laptops to you that we got from, wherever. We'll talk about that in a second. But we're also providing services on top of that. We're gonna help maintain them. We're gonna provide whatever sort of help desk support you need, whatever. So we're not just a regular reseller. We're adding value to that. And so now the question about compliance comes down to how is this acquisition being classified? Because each acquisition contains a NAICS code, and the NAICS is designated with a NAICS code, and the NAICS code drives what type of limitations on subcontracting apply. And so if the NAICS code says it's an acquisition of product, it's an acquisition of laptops first and foremost, then okay, now we have to comply with the limitation on subcontracting for product. But we don't have to comply with it for services, which means that we could sell our services to, or subcontract the services to whatever, but the product part has to comply with the limitations on subcontract, which would mean that either the end manufacturer of those laptops has to be a small business, or there has to be a waiver of that because there is no domestic small business that produces that product. And so you'd have to still be sure that you could comply with that. If that value-added reseller type acquisition is classified with the services code, and I think this is where a lot of folks end up, it looks like they are, somehow doing an end around on these limits, but they're not really. Let's say that same acquisition seeks both the laptops and it seeks some sort of services after the fact. Let's say the government says, what we really want is a service. Yeah, we want those computers, but we want 5 years of services on top of that. We want someone to take care of it. We want them to answer the phone. When there's a problem, we want to come over and do that sort of support on site, whatever. Okay, now, so we've classified that as an IT services contract. In that case, the laptops can come from wherever, because the limitation on subcontracting only applies to the portion of the contract to which the government has classified. The government has now classified this as a services acquisition. And that's where I think a lot of folks say, okay, I'm a value-added reseller. I'm able to buy Dell laptops because even though they're not a small business, it doesn't matter. The government has classified this as a services contract. I can get my product from anywhere, and then the services piece is the piece that I have to, make sure that either I do myself or that I'm subbing to, within that 50% limitation on subcontracting to another small business, potentially something like that. So yeah, it ends up sort of looking like you did an end around on the limitation on subcontracting. That's because the government is seeking both product and service, and that you, by providing the service under the way the acquisition is classified, were able to get the product from a large business. But again, that depended on how that acquisition was classified.
No, that makes perfect sense. Um, Final thoughts here. I don't know if we missed anything. I know we covered it pretty well, but I don't know if you got any final thoughts just on the whole strategy in general, or if there's anything we missed that you wanted to add to it today.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just emphasize at the end this whole notion that, we talked a lot about the legality of the middleman strategy as it's out there, and how a lot of folks are kind of missing the boat on that, or at least kind of skipping over the relevant pieces. And so I would leave folks with a few just kind of summary tips, which is, number one, if you're looking at one of these courses, or whatever they're trying to sell you about middleman strategy, and they don't mention any of the stuff we talked about today, any of the rules we talked about today, then they probably either don't know what they're talking about, or they're, even worse, just trying to pretend those rules don't exist. And you don't want to be in that universe. And so first things first is to be, in evaluating anything that pops up like this, say, hey, am I sure, or can I become sure that, legally speaking, what's being proposed is going to fit within the exceptions that allow middleman? Number one. Number two, I would still say to myself, am I okay if I can find said opportunities in which the strategy is legally viable? Am I okay with the fact that when I sign on the dotted line that government contract, I am 100% legally liable for what is in that document? And even if I'm subcontracting the work, if my subcontractor defaults or doesn't follow the law, I'm on the hook for it. For example, I've seen companies in which actually a number of these recently, in which the contract was subject to what's called the Service Contract Act, or Davis-Bacon Act. And those are statutes that require employees to be paid alternate minimum wages that are higher than the national minimum wage, essentially, is what that is. I'm oversimplifying a little bit. It's called prevailing wages. Those contract clauses flow down to subcontractors. What happens if you subcontract all the work and your sub doesn't pay the prevailing wage, the alternate minimum wage, to its employees? You know what? You, the prime contractor, are responsible for making that up to the subcontractor's employees. You're legally liable for the fact that your subcontractor did. I've seen folks pay millions of dollars to subcontractors' employees because the subcontractor didn't pay the prevailing wage. So take a look at that. I'm not trying to scare anyone off of government contracting. It's great business, but the reason why it often, the successful contractors are not those who look at this as a side hustle, but who invest hours, countless hours in work in this, is because they are comfortable. They understand these rules, and they're comfortable with the fact that they know how to comply with them, and they now know how to hold their subcontractors to comply with them. And if you look at that contract and you think, gosh, I don't know what on earth I would do if my sub defaulted, that would put me in bankruptcy, it's something you got to consider, because you are 100% responsible for what's in that document. The government will not take my subcontractor walked off the job as a legal excuse.
Yeah, no, great advice, because again, it's one of those things where there's a lot of things you can do. That doesn't mean you should do it. And this is often one of those cases. I always tell people, when you're getting in this business and you can perform a service, I would rather see you go out and look for a service contract where you can self-perform than go out and try to find product contracts where you've got to juggle all of these things. You've got to juggle invoices and cash flow and relationships. Go out and self-perform. One contract win could take you from the job you have today for a boss you don't like to the most demanding boss you've ever had in your life yourself, right? It could take, like, overnight, you could win one contract and flip that switch and be out of that. And it's not a side hustle. So, it's easy to do in one respect when you can perform a service. The product side, to me, is the one that it looks attractive because it kind of has that Amazon, eBay, drop shipping feel to it, which, how many people do you know in your neighborhood who do that for a living successfully? I always ask that question, like, how many people do you know? Because it's been around a long time, but a lot of people can't crack that nut. They can't figure out how to make that work. And this is more complicated. This is way more complicated than, doing an Amazon drop shipping business. It's way more complicated. So
It
thank
is.
you for coming on and talking about this. And I honestly, I hope it did scare some people a little bit, to at least go and research before they
Yeah,
buy.
I mean, I people who are looking for that quick fix, that sort
Yeah,
of thing. I mean, those are people who should be thinking twice about this. Government contracting is a great business for a lot of folks. I mean, you and I have both worked with a lot of successful contractors, people who've made a lot of money. I'm not going to lie off this, but they've worked hard at it, and
yeah,
so people who are looking for a quick way to make a quick buck, this
it's
isn't
not
the
good.
market for
This
you.
is not.
I just don't think it is. I mean,
No.
this is not the way to do it. But if you are the sort of person who's willing to invest the time and the effort to become knowledgeable, it can be a wonderful
It can be
line of
awesome.
work. Absolutely.
It can be awesome. So cool. Thank you again. I really appreciate you coming on. Best wishes and good luck on your next pickleball game and your next blog post. And I look forward to it. And thanks again, man. I look forward to having you on again.
Sounds great. Fantastic. Thanks for having me this morning.